Okay, so hello everyone. This is our February Tizard Behavioral Talk. I am Thanos Vostanis. I am a lecturer here at the Center at the University of Kent, where we offer courses, master's courses in applied behavior analysis and positive behavior support that are verified by ABAI if you want to become a board certified behavior analyst, and by the UK Society for Behavior Analysis if you want to become what we now call here in the UK a UKBA cert. We also offer PhD opportunities if any of you are interested in pursuing research in the beautiful science of behavior analysis and positive behavior support. We have a peer-reviewed academic journal. It's called Tizard Learning Disability Review, and I always encourage you folks to consider submitting your work to the journal. It has an impact factor. It's practitioner focused, which means that case studies and more applied work will be welcomed. It doesn't need to be your magnus opus. It's fine. You can send us things that are more applied, and we will still consider publishing those as well. The Tizard Behavioral Talks is our attempt to disseminate behavior analysis in the UK, but of course across the globe, since we're doing this online. And that is why we have esteemed colleagues like Dr. Anna Linehan that join us, and they present their lovely work. So Anna is going to discuss today some quite advanced but super interesting concepts around behavior analysis that I hope you will enjoy. So Anna, could I just actually before I ask you to talk to us about your current work and then take it away, guys, keep in mind I will interrupt Anna at 3 points during the session. I will deliver 3 keywords. You will need to make sure you have those written down somewhere. And towards the end of the session, I will post the link for a Microsoft form where you can add those keywords, and then I will prepare your CEU certificate. Give me 30 to 40 days to prepare them. I try to do them sooner, but don't worry if you don't get them straight away. If for any reason you don't have access to the chat, you can email me, and you can find my email on the Tizard Center website at tizard.org, www.tizard.org. Just type my name in the search bar. My details will come up. You can email me and I can help you out. Because I know that sometimes folks join from mobile devices and other devices that might not have access to the chat. Okay, enough of ground rules and plugging Tizard. Anna, thank you for joining us today. Could I ask you to, first of all, talk to us about the opportunities at Endicott? Then tell us about what you're currently working on, just so we are up to date with your most recent work. And then please take it away, and I will be supporting you in the background while you are presenting.
Sure. Thank you so much, Thanos. I'm truly honored to be here today, especially talking about this work, which is so timely in the field of behavior analysis. I am currently working on projects through Endicott College on Assent, and more specifically on how to develop constructional programs using a nonlinear contingency analysis, which it just so happens, even though Assent may be something newer that we're talking about in this field for some of us, Goldiamond was talking about this decades ago. And so it just fits naturally into this type of programming. And I'm really excited to be able to show that and bring that forward. My other areas of research that I'm working on currently are on a contingency analysis of emotions and emotional behavior. And so I'm actually going to be delivering a TED Talk on that topic coming up in April. And so that should be available coming up, which is a really nice way for behavior analysis to get involved in an area that typically isn't something that is discussed. It's kind of like, oh, well, that's the private event stuff, and we can't really do much in that area, but we really can. So we're working on that area in my research lab here at Endicott College, Emotions Research Lab. The other thing that's really cool that we're working on at Endicott College in our group is dissemination of the nonlinear contingency analysis and constructional approach. We're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Joe Lang as an advisor and instructor in the doctoral program. And if you're all interested in learning more or having a deeper dive into this area, if you currently already have a master's degree, we do open up our electives in the doctoral program to members of the community outside of Endicott for a reduced rate on the tuition. So that's something that you could look forward to. It'll be posted on my LinkedIn when it's available. You can come in and register as a non-degree seeking student and actually take a course with TV Joe Lang on this in sort of a deep dive. And I would really encourage anyone to do that who is interested in this area or interested in getting more involved with the constructional approach, how to look at nonlinear relations, and how to kind of move your career forward in a way that to me feels a lot more compassionate. So that's a little bit about our current work, and we'll open
We
me
are
up, I think.
drooling already. We are drooling already, just so you know.
Oh yeah, I mean we had a lot of folks who were not students enroll in the last course, which was the first time it was offered last fall, so it'll be coming again this fall. And we had people from Australia, we had people from the US, we have people from all over. So definitely be on the lookout for that. We also have a range of other electives that if you're interested in, some of our really esteemed adjunct, we're lucky that we have adjunct faculty teach in our doctoral program from all over. So there's a chance you could learn from Peter Gerhardt or Caio Miguel or others that are really at the forefront of some of the really cool stuff happening in the field. But of course, I'm partial to nonlinear. So let me see if I can share my screen, and Thanos, please let me know if it's working. It says presenting. Oh yeah, okay, yes. I think it's working.
I can see your PowerPoint coming up now, yet.
Play from the start. Okay,
all
how does
right.
that look?
You're on your first slide, all good, looking good. You're good.
Great, awesome. So one of the things that really got me thinking about this area in terms of Assent was this recent or fairly recent addition of Assent to the BACB code of ethics. And I'm going to assume that either most people here or if not everyone has at least heard of that credentialing board or are familiar with the BCBA credential. And so one thing that happened, if you're not, is this inclusion of something called Assent. And people started to get really interested in it, but nobody really knew what it was, how to start moving forward with, do we put it in our programs? How do we talk about it? How do we measure it? So one of the things I was interested in and others is, well, okay, what is it? So we do have a little bit of language around Assent that is provided from some different sources that can help us understand it better. So in the ethics code I was just talking about, there is a definition of vocal or non-vocal verbal behavior that can be taken to indicate willingness to participate in research or behavioral services. So, okay, that gives us a nice little start there. That's what we're supposed to be doing in terms of looking at Assent. So here's one thing that's really interesting. Willingness to participate. Okay, that's great. What does that actually mean? And that's something that we were interested in investigating. And then again, vocal or non-vocal verbal behavior. So that's another interesting part of Assent. What is that really telling us about how the individual is interacting with the teaching procedure or the type of behavioral programming that we're implementing? So in the US, we also have the Department of Health and Human Services, which provides laws and regulations in terms of how we conduct research. And so one regulation defined Assent as a child's affirmative agreement to participate in research. Mere failure to object should not, absent of affirmative agreement, be construed as Assent. So there's a little bit more language around what Assent should be in terms of what our code says, and then also what we have in terms of regulation, at least in this country, and I assume other countries have similar things. And digging a little bit deeper, we can look at pediatric practice, and there are actually 9 different areas in which they describe this decision-making or assent-informed practice when it comes to the medical field. So they have things like constitute a process, not a discrete event, decision-making, it's shared with the family, autonomy, assessment. An important thing here, dissent should be considered and respected. So what happens when you lose assent? Physicians can challenge or question the parental choices to prevent harm. So just a lot of different language here around what could be involved in terms of assent in not only clinical practice for behavior analysts, but also we can look at other areas in other fields. So there's a lot of language already out there in terms of assent. Do we have assent? Well, how do we know? So this judgment is usually based solely on topography. Even if we look at the previous definitions that I just went through, a lot of what was discussed were behaviors, right? So, oh, a child is smiling. They must be really happy and engaged with this program. They're nodding in agreement. Yes, yes, I want to be doing this. Or potentially frowning. Is there some type of dissent going on? Or crying, again, is that an indicator of dissent? And some look at only one contingency. So for example, if we're deploying positive reinforcement procedures, does that automatically mean we have assent? And so here's a little bit more of a lens of how people may already be thinking about not only what's provided in the codes and in terms of how potential programs are already operating. So that's it, right? That should be enough for us. We have some topographies, we have some definitions. No, that's definitely not enough, and that's what we were interested in investigating. So here are a few citations. The Toward a Constructional Approach to Social Problems, Behavior, Goldheim in 1974, 2002. This paper can be challenging to get through. There's quite a bit in there. But this is really part of the stimulus for what we're going to talk about in these other 2 papers that have recently been published online only in the special issue of Compassion, Applied Behavior Analysis, and Behavior Analysis in Practice. So these are actually companion papers. The first one, The Foundations of Preemptive Compassion, I'll go through this a little bit more. We wanted to take a deeper dive into what do the words and under what conditions will we describe things like compulsion, consent, and assent, because there's some lack of clarity we were finding in talking to people about what is the difference between consent and assent. It seemed like a lot of folks were thinking, well, if we have consent, that is assent, and that's not quite the case. And then this other paper, Can There Be Compassion Without Assent? A Nonlinear Constructional Approach, actually takes the readers through some really nice case examples of how we can start to think about assent in terms of a contingency analysis. So one of the things that was really important to us as we were looking at putting forward this information was this idea of preemptive compassion. And that idea actually came from Goldheim. And he talked about preemptive, not compassion, but it's implied, I think. He talked about preemptively creating programs or research that would allow an individual to have some autonomy in terms of how they would be engaging in certain programs. So again, a lot of this stems from behavior analysis. It's just for whatever reason, it hasn't come forward, and we're really happy to start bringing these conversations forward. What I was referring to actually as well was what Goldheim had written in terms of the Belmont Report, which if you're familiar with research, you'll know the Belmont Report is really important and started to pull together how we can have protections for human subjects in research. So looking at some of the behavior analytic research, there has been a nice movement in terms of compassion and compassionate care. So Taylor et al. In 2019 talked about compassion converting empathy into an act aimed at the alleviation of suffering. That's really important, and that gets us set up for how we start to think about these words. So empathy is actually, you're thinking about, you care about something, but compassion is actually an act of relieving some of that suffering. So when we were thinking about that, we thought that empathy is defined as a behavior that expresses concern, but doesn't necessarily involve the actions, where compassion does involve the actions in the mitigation of distress. But what if we could preempt? What if compassion, although should always be present, what if we didn't even have to go there yet? Because our programs were built in such a way that we didn't have to have as much distress or suffering or prevent it. And that lends itself nicely right into the constructional approach, which is an orientation whose solutions to problems is the construction, hence the constructional part of what we're talking about of repertoires, rather than their reinstatement or transfer to new situations. But the biggest thing here is rather than the elimination of repertoires. So I feel like in our field, we've gotten a little heavy on assessing the function of a behavior with the purpose of eliminating or reducing a repertoire, which is valid and it pays for things because that's what insurance funders want. But what's best for the client? It's better to understand why that behavior is occurring and build the repertoires or build the skills that are missing that makes that behavior less valuable to that person. So there are 5 elements of the constructional approach if you're not already familiar with them, and I'm going to revisit this later within an example. But the first element is you're looking at the terminal repertoires. So where do you want to go? And it's really important that you is emphasized. It's not where do I want to go as a therapist, it's where does the client want to go? What are their goals? And that's the emphasis. The current relevant repertoires, where are you now in terms of your goals? And again, where are you? Not where am I? Where is the client? The change procedures, how do we get there together? What are the maintaining consequences? What's going to keep you going once we get to some of these changes, once we reach some of these goals? And then how are you going to follow your progress? So you can see this is 1974. So I don't know where this has been, but I have only come into contact with this in the past few years, and I'm really, really glad that I did. So in order to understand a little bit more about the constructional approach, we have to think a little bit about also the pathological approach, which is something that I think most of us, at least in the verbal community I exist in, kind of lives in. Things are more pathologized. I go see someone because I have a problem, rather than looking to just build a goal and move on it. So in a pathological approach, the focus is generally on the alleviation or elimination of some form of distress or some form of symptom. It's often considered the problem in terms of the pathology. So in terms of, that piece that's wrong, rather than how is that problem actually established or developed, how is it maintained, and then is it to be eliminated? So one of the things that I really like thinking about, yes.
Could I pause you there? Sorry, just to deliver the
Yep.
first keyword. Folks,
Yes.
the first keyword for your CU is apple, as in the fruit. The first keyword for your CU is apple. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And so when we start to think about some of these things, I just have a couple examples of the terminal repertoire, because I think that's really important, because a lot of times when we start with our programs, the terminal repertoire is generally the alleviation of the undesirable behavior, and that's the pathological approach. Whereas in a constructional approach, the question is what needs to be established, absence of which is the problem. Assuming we are successful, again, what would the outcome be for you? Extend that desired pattern behavior, and then look for specified observable and measurable outcomes. One of the things I like to say too, as I'm talking a bit about the constructional approach, is you might say, hey, I'm already doing a lot of this stuff. And you probably are. The constructional approach isn't something that we're trying to sell or it's not, you know, something that's new or a different type of ABA. It's based on the science. So if that comes up for you during this talk, that's probably going to be true. So another indication of a difference between a pathological or constructional approach. In pathological, we're deploying methods to eliminate or decrease those undesirable behaviors, which could include extinction, punishment, differential reinforcement procedures, or some verbal exercises to decrease undesirable thoughts, sometimes exposure therapy. Whereas in the constructional approach, we're looking at program steps that will shape the entry repertoire into those target repertoires. So where do we start, and then how do we get to where we need to go? In terms of linear and nonlinear programming, typically a linear program is what most of us learn. We're looking only at the variables related to what Gold Diamond referred to as the referent behavior, or what we'll consider the problem behavior, what's to be eliminated. And so many of us may be familiar with our ABC analysis. And so for me, it was part of this journey where, well, the ABC analysis really didn't give me enough information. I was still seeing in some of my interventions a lot of problem behavior. Students weren't learning the way they should be. And when I found this approach, it really started to help me think about the behavior that's a problem being more informational. And so by deploying these methods, I was able to really start to dive in deeper into some of these issues. And I'll show you some examples that might help you understand that in a minute. So in a nonlinear approach, we look at what are some alternatives to access a critical reinforcer. And by a critical reinforcer, I mean the reinforcer that is selecting the contingency. So there are all types of reinforcers out there, obviously, but at that moment, what is that person willing to work for? What is that person wanting? And then what would happen? This is one of my favorite questions. What would happen to the individual if they were not engaging in whatever the problem was? And it blows people's mind, I feel like, when you start to think about that. We're really focused on the problem. Oh, this client has a lot of aggression. Well, what would happen to them if they didn't have any aggression? Or what are times when there is no aggression? When is the problem not a problem? If you start asking yourself those questions, you'll really start to see some really important information. And along with that, we can start to look at what are the benefits and the costs of not only the problem, but also the available alternative behaviors. So in a nonlinear analysis, we not only want to have this top row where it's like our problem behavior and the costs and benefits, but we want to look at all the other available alternatives, because those will have an effect on that problem behavior. And what do I mean by that? So here's an example where this is a real example, and I'm sure many folks have come across something like this. Maybe it's not a parent, but maybe you think of some other context in your life where someone was not following instructions and only reporting problems. So in this case, it was the parent of a child with a diagnosis of autism who was working with a BCBA, and they were only reporting problems, and they weren't doing what the BCBA wanted in terms of the programming. So this was really kind of hard for that BCBA. Not only were they feeling not effective in helping the client, not effective in helping the parent, but they were also having to deal with a lot of phone calls and other issues when it came to this parent. So we can start to think, what are some alternatives to access the critical reinforcer? So if we just, take a bird's eye view here, if the parent's not following the instruction and only reporting problems, but has persistent phone calls, what does it seem like they're after? Probably some attention from the BCBA. What would happen if they didn't engage in that problem behavior? What would happen to them if they were following directions? What would be happening to them if they didn't report on the problems? And then what are the benefits and costs of these problems and their alternatives? So in a nonlinear analysis, we can see the parent having non-adherence and complaining. It would annoy the BCBA and it would get them more meetings. That's what was happening. But if we look at the available alternatives, the parent could have also been following directions. But if they were doing that, they get forgotten and have infrequent meetings. So you can see here, by doing this type of an analysis, you can actually get at what's really going on with the parent. Why are they not following directions? What makes that problem behavior actually not a problem for the parent? It's more of an adaptive behavior because it allows them to get what they need. And so the only resolution here was to schedule regularly occurring meetings. Once that happened, all of the non-adherence and complaints went away. The parent just needed to know when they were going to be able to talk, when they were going to get contact with the BCBA. Now, a lot of times what I see in the literature, in particular for some kind of non-adherence or trying to get parents to adhere to plans, or, sometimes I see the word compliance. It just seems like a lot of effort goes into some of this teaching, where really if there was a nonlinear analysis done, potentially we could just avoid some of that wasted time. So considering the alternatives provides a more complete picture of an overall contingency analysis of what's going on with the potential problem, which has significant implications on a contingency analytic interpretation of assent. And something that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is kind of an advanced topic, but hopefully we can simplify it for you, is something called degrees of freedom. And that, again, was talked about by Golddiamond in 1976 in his writing for the Belmont Report. So degrees of freedom is a fancy way to just talk about how many alternatives are available, and it can be in a range of systems. Sometimes degrees of freedom are used in statistical analyses. So if you're a stats person, you may have seen this term before. But it's just basically how many alternatives are there for something minus one. Because if you only have, then there's only one thing. There aren't really alternatives. So that's the minus one. So this is what Golddiamond was talking about in terms of offering up those available
Anna?
alternatives to get, yes.
Could you repeat it? You broke up a bit. Your connection got a bit slow. Could you quickly go again? We've kind of lost you where you were discussing how many minus one.
Can you hear me now?
We can. It's just that it became a bit laggy.
Okay.
If you could just go over it one more time, that would be great. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Yes. No, thank you. Let me know if it goes out again. So in terms of degrees of freedom, it's a term that's used to talk about a range of systems. And so if you're a statistics person, you may have heard of this term before. But Golddiamond talked about it in terms of contingency analysis. So as we talked about before, how many available alternatives does one have to get to that critical reinforcer? And then you minus it by one. Because if someone only has one alternative, then there really isn't a lot of freedom there. So I'll show you some more examples of what this means. So you might have a client that loves playtime. And so let's just assume playtime is a critical reinforcer in this case. Now they have lots of different ways here to get the access to that playtime. They could do a sorting program if they have sorting skills. They could do a motor program if they have motor skills, or they could just ask for playtime if they have manding or requesting skills. So number of alternatives minus one in this case would be 2. So 2 degrees of freedom, or 2 available alternatives here to access that playtime. But what if this individual doesn't have the ability to mand for playtime or to ask for playtime? Well, you can see right now they've already reduced their degree of freedom by 1. So now it's 2 minus 1 is 1 degree of freedom. What if the motor program or asking for playtime is not available? Now they have 0 degrees of freedom. The only way they can get to playtime, which may be a positive reinforcer, is to participate in the sorting program. Same thing, what if they don't have sorting skills or banding skills? The only way to access playtime would be doing a motor program. So you can see how we can start to understand how we arrange our programs so that individuals have more available opportunities to get their critical consequence. So we considered Assent in terms of defining it, how we can talk about it as a community, to be important to discuss in terms of degrees of freedom. So how we went forward with this contingency analysis of Assent is using something called a concept analysis. And you may have never heard of a concept analysis, but if you're familiar with Skinner's verbal behavior, it's similar to what we would consider an abstract tact. Or if you're still not really familiar with that, you can think of lots of concepts in your world, like a chair, an apple, a range of different things that have certain what we would call critical features. The features of that particular stimulus that must be present in order for us to say that thing. So for example, in the case of a chair, and you don't necessarily have to be aware of the critical features. In the case of a chair, you may not know a chair has 3 critical features. If I asked you to name all 3, could you do it? I know I couldn't when I first learned about this. So a chair has a back. It's a seat for one person. And the relative leg to seat ratio puts your legs at about 90 degrees. Now, there are a range of ways that we can vary a chair. Could be different materials like wood, metal. It can have a different amount of legs. It can have different colors. But it has to have those 3 things for us to discriminate chairs from not chairs. So let's say I move from a single seat occupancy to a double seat occupancy. Then I move from a chair to a love seat, or I don't know if you have a different term, but basically a seat for 2 people. So we use that same kind of analysis to look at a concept of assent. And so what we saw was, how do we develop something where we can talk about these things consistently as a community through the use of an example of assent and then non-examples, so we can have a discrimination? And that's how you want to build out this type of analysis. So overall, we looked at those definitions, like I talked about in the beginning of the talk, and the theme was there's some form of participation in an activity or program. This willingness to participate seemed like a common theme. So we have that as at the top. And then what are some different ways individuals or other organisms participate in an activity or a program? Well, you can be compelled to do it or coerced. You can consent, or you can also assent. So in the top row there, we have those 3 concepts, which we call coordinate concepts. Because if you notice in number 1, they all have the same, what we call critical feature. And then number 2, they start to vary a little bit. And then 3, they really vary. So this is how we build out the examples and non-examples. So in terms of the number 3 here, for compulsion or explicit coercion, there's application of an aversive for non-participation. So you participate or else. You don't get the thing. Or I'm going to force you to somehow, using some type of prompting or something. And then in consent is usually a discrete event, like signing a contract, and it happens prior to the implementation of a program. Now, someone can consent to something and they can withdraw their consent, but in order to go back into that same program, they would have to issue another consent or sign another consent. Whereas assent is this agreement to participate, but it's obtained continuously during the program. And that's really important. we have to be looking at how are we arranging our programs, whether they're for skill acquisition or potentially behavior reduction, in terms of how is the individual interacting with them. And that sounds easy, and we can do some work in this area, but if you're questioning me a little bit, I understand, believe me. But we can even take it a step further. And what Gold Diamond talked about in terms of apparent or genuine, and he talked about it in terms of consent, and we've added assent here too. And that pulls in our degrees of freedom. So someone can be participating in a program or an animal or another organism. There can be agreement to participate, right? Like maybe they're working for that particular favorite snack or an iPad or some other type of reinforcer. But how many ways do they have to get to that? If they can only get that reinforcer, like we saw with our different sorting, manding, and other programs, well, then they still have a little implicit coercion or what we call apparent assent to actually get to that reinforcer. But if there are multiple ways, those available alternatives to get to the same critical reinforcer, we've expanded the degrees of freedom to reach that consequence. And so we're moving along a trajectory of getting willingness, we would say. And so for genuine assent, like you saw on the previous slide, here's just a blow up of those critical features. And then there are a whole range of variable features. So approach responses, those are some of those topographical behaviors that can allow us to start to think about some of these things, but those are not critical in terms of knowing whether or not we actually have genuine assent. We may have apparent assent, but have we arranged contingencies such that that individual or that organism can get that reinforcer in multiple ways? So taking degrees of freedom into account can be really revealing in establishing programs. So once again, here's our sorting program, motor program, and then manding program for playtime. Number of degrees of alternatives -1 gives us 2 degrees of freedom. But what it also lets us do, and this is really cool, the other 2 consequences, effort, ambiguity, difficulty, length, whatever it might be that an individual is experiencing in these different types of programs can have their effect. So what I mean by that is, say we have this all available for the person. There are these different programs, they have skills or they have some entry repertoire to be able to participate in the programs. They get the same critical consequence through all the programs, but the only program a particular student wants or a learner wants is, say, the sorting program. It's the program they go to every single time. Well, that lets us know a little bit about the motor program and the manding program. It allows us to program changes so that the learner doesn't always select just one program. But that's in a contingency analysis. It's not just offering a choice of a different program. So if assent is withdrawn or not present to begin with, what could we do about it now that we have a little bit more information, a little bit more go on with our analysis? One thing to consider is, how does the program benefit your learner's overall growth and development? Or in other words, is it even worth it? Maybe that program, it came up on an assessment somewhere, but is it really something meaningful for that individual? We need to be thinking about these things. So again, back to our 5 elements of the constructional approach, just a little preview here as we move into the next example. Remember, we want to know where do you want to go? Where are you now? How do we get there? And then what's going to keep you going? And how do we follow progress? So
Anna,
here's a case.
Can I pause you there for a second just to deliver the second keyword? Thank you. Okay, guys, the second keyword for your CEU is playtime. The second keyword for your CEU is playtime.
Great, thank you. So here's a case example. Some of you may have a client like this, an 8-year-old client that has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and is verbal. This individual attends a special needs private school and would get angry or destroy the classroom. The teacher takes other students out or sends him out when this occurs. And as you can imagine, it does disrupt the class and could possibly injure the student themselves or others with some of the behaviors that were displayed. So taking a closer look, once the teacher asked for some assistance here, it was seen that this behavior really only occurred in a small group math lesson. It was consistently occurring in one part of the day. This student could answer questions vocally, could have a nice interaction with the teacher while she was teaching, as long as a question was posed vocally. But when it came time for worksheets, that was when he would get set off, in particular when there were corrections. And it's important to note too that the individual in terms of the math worksheet, he struggled with writing the number 4. Would always write it backwards. And so what the teacher would do when she would come around and check the student work, she would erase the 4 and have him rewrite it. And that would kind of send him. It really irritated him, and he would end up destroying the classroom. So what these individuals did was tell him he can go about whatever he wants and honor it every time. So that might sound a little like, oh, do we really want to tell someone they can escape a math worksheet whenever they want? Well, in this case, you'll see it did actually work out pretty well. And then some more analysis could happen. When does the individual tend to go out? When does he want to escape? Again, when does he not want to escape? I feel like we never ask ourselves those questions. When is the problem not a problem? What would happen if he stayed in? So again, looking at setting up that, if you remember the referent behavior, the available alternatives, does he get the same consequence if he stays in? And then looking at a nonlinear intervention, during writing lessons, a teacher's assistant pulled him aside and worked with him on fluency. So escaping the class became no longer potent. So let's see what that looks like. Just going to skip over this real quick for time, but basically when we talk about a program, it's just a sequence of contingencies that lead to a specified outcome. So I say program a lot of times in terms of talking about teaching procedures, but it could also be a procedure that we're talking about with potentially looking at other behavior. So here, if we think about our previous example in terms of looking at critical consequence, so if the critical consequence for this learner was escape, that's what he was getting for trashing the classroom, we could look at a degrees of freedom analysis. So we have the classroom and the teacher is all out for all of the setting here on the left-hand side. And then let's look at the available alternative behaviors. There's handwriting, which would lead to unsuccessful worksheet and corrections, or he could yell and crumple the paper, which would lead to no handwriting and exit the room. So here, the only escape that this individual had was no handwriting and exiting the room, because he couldn't write well at this point. And so there was really 0 degrees of freedom for him to get that escape. Once they added in that break response, which is something we do a lot, right? Teaching a functional communication response. But where do we go from there? This allows us to put in a functional communication response, not as the end-all be-all, but to give us information about the program. So once they put in, can I get a break? You can see here now, this individual has 1 degree of freedom, which makes yelling and crumpling the paper less potent in this case. Now, it's not getting the student to be successful with his handwriting yet, but it gives him an opportunity to engage in other behavior without that disturbing pattern being as potent. So while this situation was in effect, this is when they could pull out that individual student and teach him the handwriting skills he needed so that other alternative could become real. Because although we consider that the student maybe has that alternative because they have some writing in their repertoire, if they don't possess all the component skills, then it's really not considered a true alternative. And it's really important to think about that when we think about our learners. So here, as we start to unpack it a little bit, we can see we still have the classroom and the teacher in all cases. He could do the handwriting as it was initially with being unsuccessful and leading to corrections, which was not an outcome he was after. He could yell and crumple the paper, have no handwriting, and exit the room, which gets back to the critical consequence of escape. He could ask for a break, which would also lead to escape. And then he could also participate in the individualized shaping program for writing 4s, which led to no handwriting or worksheet, which was still escape from that particular activity. So once the handwriting skills were shaped, now a real alternative is actually completing the worksheet. So if we still have the same critical consequences escape, but now the individual is able to write well, they're able to finish the worksheet, possibly get praise from the teacher, and move on to the next thing. Yelling and crumpling the paper and asking for a break were no longer as valuable to this learner, and so they didn't occur. And what's important to notice here too with this type of assessment and program is that yelling and crumpling the paper was never directly targeted. It just became less valuable, and actually it's a higher cost than doing some of these other things. So here we talk about the handwriting becoming a true alternative, and then also the consequence of escape allowed the handwriting itself to become a valuable part of the program. And so the program itself, being able to write well, led to being a reinforcer within the program, which didn't have to have this extrinsic FCR, functional communication response for a break. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of a lot to unpack, but it just provides an alternative way to start thinking about what's actually going on with the problem, but then what's missing and how can we build that up so the problem is less of a problem. And we have to look at these degrees of freedom so it can help us understand how many different ways does that individual have true alternatives to get to that consequence. It's much different than simply providing choices. The contingency analysis allows the program itself to function as a reinforcer, or what we call in the paper, program-specific consequences, which is what we want for all of our learners. So what does it mean to be constructional? We're really looking to establish the repertoire, the absence of which is the problem. So consider telling yourself that over and over, and it can be tricky and you might not get it right the first time. Maybe you take too big of a step. But once we really start to think about these things, it's very revealing and you find you can get behavior change a lot quicker. And then of course, we want to maximize degrees of freedom. How many different ways does that individual have to get to that critical consequence? Obviously, there are times where more coercive practices are recommended, and we talk about this in the paper too. Like, you can't have children running in the street. You can't have people drinking bleach, or, obviously there are a range of different things that can occur that can be very dangerous, and we need to be mindful of that. But where in our programs can we look at establishing repertoires and maximizing degrees of freedom? Even within those dangerous behaviors, we can look at what is that person trying to get out of doing that? And are there different ways they can get that? So a program with Assent doesn't necessarily mean it's a good program, but a good program should have Assent. Now, what do I mean by that? We really want to make sure that we're constantly evaluating our programs. Okay? Is it meaningful for the learner? How can we start thinking about these things within the context of Assent? Assent is a part of the constructional program, not something one adds on. which I think is the beauty of looking at a nonlinear constructional approach. We don't have to program for Assent. Assent is the program. We can think of Assent withdrawal like a check engine light coming on. It lets us know when there's something wrong in our programs. And adjustments to the program should be made, not adjustments to the children or to whoever your client might be. And it's always important to remember, it's not the failure of the learner, but the failure of the program. We are the ones establishing these things. Take it back to the 5 questions of the constructional approach. Take it back to degrees of freedom. What is it about the program that learner is trying to get away from? So always want to check your program. If you're interested in further reading on these topics, I highly recommend these books, The Nonlinear Contingency Analysis, Going Beyond Cognition and Behavior in Clinical Practice, goes through more fine-grained detail on a lot of things I just talked about. The Programming Contingency Analysis of Mental Health is kind of a heavy read, so that one you might want to do with someone else, but it's also an excellent, excellent text. If you're interested in learning more or having more conversations about this particular topic, we have a Facebook group, Constructional Approach to Behavior Analysis. We offer book clubs, and we also have a nice discussion going on the Facebook group. And it's a way for us to connect with each other so we can continue to have these conversations. And then I left my email there at the bottom if anyone would like to contact me to talk more about Assent or any of these topics or emotions. I'd love to connect. And that's all I had. Figured I'd leave a little time if there were any questions.
Anna, thank you very, very much. Folks, you can say many things, but you cannot complain. I bring you the best of the best, and I will die on that hill. So, you know, I will give you the last keyword now. Let's go with engine. As clearly, Anna, you can see most of them, I just make them up as I go. Engine is the last keyword for your CU. Don't go just yet, folks. I need to give you the form so you can add the CU keywords and all your information. Check the chat. I'm adding the links now. One of the links is for feedback. The other link is for your CUs. Okay. Dr. Linehan, I am blown away. I'm sure everybody is blown away. You will probably now get about 100 requests for that Facebook group. And
I
you
hope
will
so.
probably have people, yeah, and you'll probably have a lot of folks now applying to do the further training at Endicott, which we've already talked about. Thank you all for a very informative, thank you, Anna, for a very informative presentation. Guys, do you have any questions? Please pop them in the chat. I can see a lot of thank yous. I can see people are really excited. Could we show the Facebook group name again, please? Anna, is it possible to bring that up again?
Yes.
And I also have a question from before, just to clarify something.
It's just a constructional approach to behavior analysis. Sorry, if you just type into Facebook, the constructional approach to behavior analysis. I'm not very good with technology, with social media. So you can also email me too if you can't find it, and I'll definitely help.
Okay, I have
and
a
that's
question
gold
that
diamond there in the
says,
picture.
was yelling and crabbling the paper available throughout the process? Was that continuously reinforced while you were working on improving the program?
That's a great question. I mean, yes, there was never any like response blocking or the paper wasn't removed. It was just backed up. So instead of being in the main session of, so the student was able to participate in the part of the math lesson that he was successful. But when it came to the writing, instead of doing the worksheet, he was pulled out to work with the staff on fluency of building the letter 4, or excuse me, the number 4. So I suppose he could have ripped up the worksheet in that session or through the pencil or engaged in any of those other behaviors, but he didn't really need to because we had backed up the program so that he was able to be successful with his writing. So they wouldn't have started with a bunch of 4s on a piece of paper. It's, can you make this line? Can you make that line? It was a precision teaching approach to build fluency. Once fluency was attained for that particular number, he was able to go back into the math lesson, participate in the worksheet, but those other escape consequences were not as valuable. He just didn't need to do it.
Another question says, someone has read the Nonlinear book, and one of the things they're unsure about is whether ACT is considered to align with a fully constructional approach or whether it's not meeting those criteria.
It definitely does not meet the criteria, but ACT is, if you look at the very back of the constructional approach book, it talks about different types of interventions. ACT would fall under the intervention of being a topical intervention, whereas a constructional approach is systemic. And what I mean by that is in ACT, we really look to change thoughts and feelings, right, by alleviating suffering through a range of practices like mindfulness and experience, kind of learning from your feelings. Whereas in the constructional approach, we take a look at the overall contingencies and what's missing in terms of repertoires. So it's actually building on making those long-term gains, but by building skills rather than looking to suppress or kind of metaphorize or move beyond some of the feelings we have.
Okay. So do you use program adherence as the indicator of assent? Is another question.
Oh, that's a great question. I wouldn't call it program adherence. What I would call it is, again, what we talked about when you have multiple ways to get to the critical reinforcer. If the individual is actively engaging in the program, you would say that the program specific consequence or reinforcers are having their effect. So I guess they're kind of like adhering to the program, but it's really the program adhering to the learner, not the learner adhering to the program. The program is established so the learner wants to be in it. One way to test for that is, let's say you allow the learner to escape. They don't have to do the program. They could either do something else or do the program, or you can offer the critical reinforcer in the absence of the program. If they're not entering into the program, there's something wrong with the program. So that's one way to think about it.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Some of you are saying you've missed the first keyword because when you were logging in, folks, keep in mind I delivered that first keyword 20 minutes in, so I cannot re-deliver it. I'm afraid, I'm sorry. I need to ensure that we are very consistent with how we provide the CEUs. Okay, Anna, thank you as ever. Hopefully we will have you come back in the future to talk more about the constructional approach and your wonderful work. Guys, thank you all for attending today. This is going to be uploaded on YouTube, and keep an eye out for our next session, which is going to be advertised soon. And I'm hoping you will also be interested in that as well. Thank you all. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Thanos. Please stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.